Welcome to Open Plaza Talks, created by the Hispanic Theological Initiative. Each episode focuses on a topic that matters to you, whether you are in the field, the academy, or the clergy. In this episode, Jasmin Figueroa talks to Crystal Cheatham about her work creating digital, progressive Christian content. For more information about today's episode, visit htiopenplaza.org.
Welcome to another episode of Open Plaza, a production of the Hispanic Theological Initiative. My name is Jasmin Figueroa, and I'm your host for today's episode. I am a PhD student in practical theology at Boston University School of Theology. Our guest today is Crystal Cheatham, who is the founder of Our Bible app, the wildly popular digital platform with the largest compilation of progressive, faith-based media content out there. She's also the visionary behind the upcoming anthology, the Deconstructionist Playbook, and the forthcoming Bemba Press. Crystal, welcome to the podcast.
It's so good to be here, Jasmin. Thank you.
For our listeners, I want to give a little bit of history. Crystal and I know each other for a couple of years. I've been honored to write for Our Bible app, and some of my work is in the Deconstructionist Playbook. When I had the idea of bringing her on to Open Plaza, this is around the time when we were doing promotion for Deconstructionist Playbook. We had a Kickstarter. We'll give a little bit more info in a bit. But more importantly, I thought that Open Plaza would be a really wonderful opportunity to introduce more people to Our Bible app and the work that you do. Personally, as a former seminarian, when I discovered your content, I was in a place where I was really frustrated with the lack of programming out there, content out there, devotional content, formational content that was written by and for folks from minoritized communities, specifically people of color and queer folks. I just found such a big disconnect between all of the popular media out there and the lived experiences of the people who were looking towards that media to help supplement their faith life. So when I first discovered Our Bible app, it was through you and through a bunch of folks on Twitter who ended up becoming writers. I found it to be a breath of fresh air, honestly, and really encouraging for me as somebody who is kind of looking around and feeling very, very isolated and feeling very disconnected from my faith. So just personally, I have a big investment in your work, and I think it's a real gift to the church and to folks who are leaving the church and have left the church, but are trying to find spiritualities and communities that can really help them accompany them in their faith processes. So I wanted to give that little bit of context in my personal story first off, just because I think that for our audience, particularly those of us who have either made the leap from being in communities into the academy, there's another layer, particularly in the theological academy, of white normativity, of very narrow boxes of what theology is and looks like. And I find that that often just clashes with our lived experience. So it's great to have a space where we can hear folks who are just like us, who are working things out and who are not leaving the faith or are heretics, or a bunch of the labels that I think people kind of put on us. So just wanted to say a little bit of that and open sort of the floor for what has this work meant to you from your end. Like, if you'd like, can you give us some background, some history, what brought you to this work?
Yeah, thank you, Jasmin. I think so much of what you said is what I had been feeling in my own, community, being an out lesbian, first of all, and coming from a very fundamentalist background. I was just having a really tough time reconciling my faith with my orientation. And it took a trip to Vanderbilt Divinity School where I participated in a protest against this, giant conglomerate of a fundamentalist institution, where I discovered that there were so many theologians who thought and felt like I did. So they were already preaching and teaching, and Vanderbilt Divinity School, much like your own experience, right, in Boston, was churning out these thought leaders who were who were who were I want to say spotlighting my experience, who were talking about it. And the event that we were protesting was actually a franchise of books and media that this Christian organization was, pumping out into the world, not just here in the U.S. but all over the world. And I thought, here they are, just like pouring all of this harmful and, like you said, boxed content into the world that doesn't really talk about anybody's personal experience. In fact, uses a lot of like spiritual bypassing to talk about the human experience. And I thought, you know what, we can do better. We can definitely do better. If anything, there are schools of theology like this around the United States, I'll say, who are capable of churning out pieces of media. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to do something about that. And I set to work creating our Bible app. And, you know, wonder of wonders, it actually touched folks. It actually started to take off. We have a huge readership at this point. And, what fed it was just me and my team reaching out to wonderful voices like yours and asking you to write something from your experience. And I think at the time when I reached out to you, we didn't even have like our publishing calendar like we have now, where we have a schedule of what we want to talk about from week to week. I just reached out to you and I was like, hey, Jasmin, I think you have an amazing platform. Your voice is important right now. And I would love to see you write something that theologizes your personal experience. And what you poured back into us, I think, was just very raw, very open, very real. That in a way that took on, not only what you were dealing with, but also what our community is dealing with race-wise, what our community is dealing with mental health, and that kind of stuff. And it was just, yeah, it was really good.
Thank you, Crystal. I was wondering if you could help me sort of give a picture for our listeners who haven't engaged with our Bible app before. What is it like? What kind of content is on there?
Right. So, the main thing that we have are daily devotionals. And when I talk about a publishing calendar, we are open to all kinds of people sending us their idea of a daily devotional. And so folks, once they open the app, there's a featured section where whatever we're talking about that week is at the very top. But depending on what it is you're going through, or what it is you're trying to work out in your faith life, there's a whole library of devotionals in there. And so some of the shelves are for LGBTQ people. Some of them are for, race in America, something you're going to want to read after another Black person gets murdered. You want to plug into a community that can hold you through that. And then we have things for the disability community. In a way, we offer devotionals that don't frame disability as some kind of sin or some kind of evil. We have things for being in relationships and processing purity culture, for for deconstruction. There's like giant section just for deconstruction. And that's just in the devotional section. And moving on from that, we have multiple Bible translations and a chat area. So we want to build community. We want you to find your community. And when you start to deconstruct your faith, people look at you a little weird. They're like, what are you doing? Are you a heretic? Are you going to hell now? And so we want to be able to give you a soft place to land if you are starting to do that.
Yeah, thank you. I think what surprised me most when I first started engaging with your content was that there was just a spirit of openness from folks who I maybe came across on Twitter, kind of knew their angle, but it was really interesting and beautiful to be able to read their devotionals and see it being authentic from the place where they were at. So, for example, you have folks like Emily Joy Allison, who does a lot of work on embodiment, right? She's also a yoga teacher, and sort of helping reframe the way that people see bodies. And also the connections with purity culture. And then you have folks who are more into mystical expressions of spirituality or indigenous expressions of spirituality, and just using language that's a little bit different from the Christianese that is so popular. It really helps normalize the fact that when we think of the church, when we think of Christianity, a lot of folks, myself included, have been taught to think that the sliver that we know encompasses Christian culture, right? But in actuality, much of it is white US evangelicalism,
Right.
or evangelicalism filtered through a different community, right? And I think for me, it was just like a really poignant reminder that it's just a sliver. These expressions, these understandings, these cultural sort of touchstones that are so popular in Christian media right there are just a sliver. And they really can't encompass the ways that many of us experience our faith, or I'm going to use different language here that might not be familiar or comfortable for everybody, but like the divine or the spirit, or any of the frameworks that just are authentic to who we really are. So I think that's really powerful.
It is really powerful. And, just something I've learned from this community is that we do ourselves a disservice when we don't ask questions, and my experience growing up in a very, very strictly Christian home was that questions were kind of forbidden. The why or who or where kind of questions had to be shoved down because we had to fit in the box. We had to behave. We had to be reverent. And what I found in this community is that asking questions, leaning into the doubt, and looking for God in the darkness is when you really start to foster a true and whole relationship with God. And that means, allowing God to love you through, love you when you're wrong, and love you through that, like that life decision that you've made, to love you through other people. Yeah, I'm just really excited about the community that I get to work with, and I've learned a lot of lessons from them.
Yeah. I was wondering if there were any examples of pushback that you've received over the years, any challenges that have come from you being a content creator who is saying like, no, I'm staking a claim. This is what, there is a gap in the
Yeah.
market. There is a gap in terms of reflecting people's lived experience. There's a gap in voices. I imagine that would be pretty controversial in some spaces.
There really used to be uh, a bigger group saying, no, don't do this, and our Bible app is only 3 years old this year. So when I was fundraising, so we'll go 4 years ago, yeah, there was a lot of pushback. There were a lot of majorly religious blogs writing about this sinful thing, and from time to time on Instagram, we'll post something, and there will be comments underneath that say, this is wrong, this is evil. How could you do this? But those voices are fading. And I think that we're seeing a real um, change in the Christian sphere for folks who are willing to ask more questions. Actually, there was a time when, I actually changed my name in Philadelphia. I go by my middle name. And that's because I just needed some separation from the work that I was doing and my normal life. And I know that other activists have also done that, but I never thought that I would have to do it because of my faith work.
Right.
But I know that a lot of this work does rub up against people's emotions and their feelings. And um, I think the dialogue is there and needs to happen for sure.
Mm. So you noticed a definite improvement and an openness in people's responses now. I was wondering what about on the ground? Do you have any connections with faith communities on the ground?
Yeah. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so one of the benefits of this platform is that you get to include and embrace and collaborate with folks all over the country, right? But I was wondering about the connection between that and sort of local activism, right? So I'm wondering if you have like supportive spaces of communities that are a little closer to home for you that
Yeah.
might be able to show support in more tangible ways.
Yeah, I actually go to a really wonderful UCC/Presbyterian church here in Philadelphia. And, I love my pastor. She's fantastic. And I continue to do work with a couple faith activist organizations that advocate for progressive faith values at the Senate level. And so I think that as far as being able to be connected here in Philadelphia, yes, I have a great support system. But there was a time, when I did stumble into a church that up front was something that it wasn't once you sat down on the pew and really got to know people.
Mhm.
And but yeah, the world is evolving. It really is.
I think so. I'm asking myself the reason why I asked that question. And in full transparency, I think it's because as much as I chafe against sort of this dichotomy that pits like the internet and social media versus like real life on the ground stuff, I think those of us who know how to utilize it well know that there are avenues for support in both, right? So it's easy for me to look at you and look at your work and look at the amount of enthusiasm and collaboration that folks have and say like, yeah, the internet's been like a really great space and it's built community. But I also wondered if that, um, if it was possible to have both. I feel like so many critics will say like, especially folks who are unfamiliar with progressive churches, that'll be sort of the catch-all, the aha moment, the um, well, if you're not plugged into a community or if you don't have sort of the stamp of approval from local communities, it's almost like illegitimate. Um, and so I was just, I was wondering if that translated into your experience or not. So it's good to hear that you've been able to experience some positive.
You know, yeah, there is this huge divide between folks who love and accept this new message and folks who don't. And I think that's where the friction is. But I think that we have landed so comfortably in a progressive Christian space that it is rare that we actually engage with that other side, what for me was a toxic theology. And so, you know, when it comes to like even the folks that will comment on our page, we have a do not engage policy of, you know, we're not going to argue. We have decided that women belong in leadership. We have decided that um, you know, that purity culture is bad and that interfaith relationships are good, and that LGBTQ people deserve to be loved. And so we've decided all these things that we're just not going to argue about anymore. And that if you come to the app, you're not going to find anything outside of that, right? And so we have invited, you know, folks from the other side of the aisle to write for us. We're not anti-conservative theology. We're just anti some of these things that we know to be harmful. And so those voices have written for us before within our parameters, and we find that it's the same gospel. It's the same gospel. But when you start to throw in all of these other politically motivated theologies, it starts to break down the message. And so that's what we're trying to do, is really protect it, and also modernize it, you know, for the world that we're living in today.
Yeah, that's awesome. For me, it seems like such a different way of being, right? And you know, as a multiply minoritized person who is in faith spaces, I always feel the pressure to defend, right? But it's exhausting.
It is.
And I imagine that for you, it could also have been exhausting to always be at the attack, right?
Yeah, you know, and I think the hopefully the response that folks come to is a decision of how you're going to respond and not closing the door, you know. And I think there is something to how terrible cancel culture can be. And I don't want to get to the point where we say, you're not allowed in the room because your theology is too conservative for me, right? Or we can't engage, or my kids can't play with your kids, because then we're doing the same exact thing that we feel like they did to us, you know, that white evangelicalism did to the Black community, you know, anyway, you know what I mean. And so we're still open to conversation. We still serve the same God, and we need to keep in mind that people are human, you know, and that everybody's growing, everybody's discovering, everybody's healing from something, and so that we have to be able to play together. Is what I'm trying to say. That's it.
Yeah. I gotta admit, that's a really challenging sentiment,
Mm-hmm.
especially after everything. I mean, I feel like I could run down the list, but it feels really, really hard to, like, it's one thing to say that, but it's another thing to live into it, right?
It's really hard. It's very hard. I would say that it wasn't my idea, and to run the app like this. But when I was in my early 20s, I worked for an organization called Soul Force, which at the time was just all about nonviolent resistance, resistance against religious oppression. And, you know, we would go into schools or universities that had policies against LGBTQ people on the books. And, you know, we would sit down with the administrators, with the student government, and talk to them about just, you know, the stats basically of how likely it was that they actually had queer students and staff at their university. And then we would talk about ways that the Bible is actually affirming of LGBTQ people. And then it would go into stories of this is how it affected my personal life. And in those conversations, our training was don't walk away having laid down the law and having learned nothing. So the point was to go in and engage and be part of this really tense conversation, not feeling like you said all the right things, but feeling like you said what you could and you listened to the other side. That was really hard. And I feel like that is the basis of what my work is on. That idea that you're not here to break somebody down. And if you're not learning from the other side, then you're not having an open dialogue. You're not having a conversation that actually moves us all forward.
Um, I'm curious about what doing that work was like for you. Um, Not just clearly it informed sort of like the ethos of your work, but I'm curious about sort of the toll for that. How did you care for yourself in the midst of it or in the aftermath? How did you kind of decompress from that sort of?
Girl, it was so traumatizing. Like it was really hard work. But luckily, I wasn't doing it alone. You know, there were 25 of us all together on that bus who were taking turns. And then afterwards, we would debrief, we would talk about it. And some of that, spiritual trauma is what really just spurred me to continue to do the work that I do. But yeah, therapy and continuing to be an activist. I'm one of those people who heals through work. And um, yeah, I think the struggle is whenever you're doing that kind of work is not to get burned out, right, and to be able to take care of yourself. But luckily for me, yeah, I had a great crew.
For a lot of folks who don't have the experience of being in a racialized body or a queer person, I think it's very easy to not have an understanding of the trauma that this work can do, of advocating for yourself, of existing in spaces that don't treat you with respect or treat you with that very nice, superficial, shallow respect, but in interactions and in policies, really just marginalize, contribute to your marginalization. And I'll speak for myself. Like I was really, really ignorant to that struggle when I went to seminary, which was a predominantly white institution, um, and Um, I burnt out really hard, not just with like racist experiences, but trying to advocate with very little experience organizing, with
Yeah.
rose-colored glasses for leaders and pastors who I thought would sort of take up the mantle and change their policies, right? But I found myself really just breaking down and disillusioned. This was around the time when I actually found, or when you contacted me about our Bible app. So, uh, for me, one of the most surprising things was oh, this is how the world actually works, right? But B, the ways that it really shook. I wouldn't say like my relationship with God in the way that some people like talk about like spiritual trauma, but for me, it shook my idea of what it meant to be a leader and an authority.
Mhm.
I came from a background where like the pastors were thought to have the most integrity of Christians around, and obviously we know of so many stories, and a lot of us have had experiences with pastors who have misused that. But I think for me, being in this space where I was already kind of suspect coming from the Bronx, right? Puerto Rican from the Bronx, right? Different community, very different culture. And then being exposed to racism, which experientially I knew was real, but like I had to fight according to the policies and the structures with folks who didn't want to change anyway, was really, really disillusioning. And at its worst, I just had a bunch of trauma responses, you know? So it really struck me how, like, when we say like this work is hard, right? We're not talking about like intellectually hard, even though it is partially. And we're not talking about strategically and how to have conversations with folks.
Right.
We're talking about, for those of us who actually have skin in the game, like can be demoralizing. It can wreak havoc on our spirits, but it also can wreak havoc on our bodies.
It is an onslaught of, and it doesn't stop, especially when when you start to realize that it's an institution, it's not a person, you know, and you are engaging with a person and you are trying to change a person, but it's actually a whole system that's set up to disenfranchise you, you know, and at those times, I can see why a resource like our Bible app makes sense, because it is outside of it. It says, you know what, this is an oasis. We're not going to engage with all of this stuff. In fact, we're going to give you some of the tools to heal yourself and water yourself, and find folks who are able to be there and hold your hand. I think some of us decide to live in that oasis and never engage again, and it takes the rare person to uh, go back and say, you know what, if we don't keep bringing people into this oasis, it won't grow. And yes, you're right. That's why it's hard, because we're not just fighting against individuals, we're fighting against systems.
Yeah, right. And they're like protecting their own interests.
Yeah.
Like, doesn't really cost them much, right? But for us, it can be our peace of mind, our well-being, our safety, our bodies. I actually, at the worst of it, you know, besides anxiety and depression, had panic attacks and then a limp, psychosomatic limp that started out of nowhere and lasted 8 months until the last day of school, and then it just miraculously disappeared.
The body keeps score.
Yeah, the body keeps the score. And it was interesting. I was taking a class sort of in the midst of this and reading a book on education, and it talked about, for people of color and predominantly white environments, this is like having bodily responses to trauma. Well, people of color tend to have more bodily somatic responses to trauma, especially if they don't have other outlets to process, right? Because I think about how that pain, that energy, that it has to go somewhere, right? And for me, I think about folks who don't have access to healthcare, right, or mental health care. I think about all the statistics about the rates of high blood pressure and everything else that people of color experience more, or people who live in poverty and, you know, multiple things experience more frequently. And I think for me, it's just the racialized trauma, right? And to really, really take it seriously is potentially like life extending, right?
Yeah.
So when I think about your work and I think about how not only does it help people name and normalize the experiences that they're having, and how it's affecting them, it also allows people to be empowered to make meaning out of it, to challenge harmful and toxic theologies, to find helpful and life-affirming theologies,
Yeah.
to collect it, right? And just I think about the sheer size of material that you have out there from people from all walks of life who are finding and reframing and empowering and sharing for like a very reasonable cost, right? Like I think about that as a way of access for folks and a way to counter sort of the crushing reality that is out there. But you know what, not just that, like it's not just like here's the world, it's heavy at times and there's so much grief, how do we maintain ourselves, but there's also so much joy there. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, like what some of the more life-giving benefits of being in community, of being in progressive communities, of our Bible app. Like, what does this do for us?
I think of my mother, who also had her own, deconstruction of faith, and came into a place where, she's reconstructing, she's feeling liberated. And I was having a conversation with her the other day because she's moving. And I said, Mom, when you move to your new place, will you do me a favor and find a church? In my head, I'm thinking, I just want you to have community. And she thinks for a while and she says, no, I'm not going to have a church. I'm not going to find a church. And she's like, I want you to know that I have never felt closer to God than I do now. And my mom is, she's in her 60s. She's beautiful. She's healthy. She's thriving. And when I think back to when we were a part of that fundamentalist faith, just how angry and frustrated she was constantly. And not, and she was going through a lot. Everybody goes through intense things in their lives, but just seeing the transformation from a woman governed by a faith, a very rule-based faith, to a woman who has stepped out of traditional go to church, kind of life, and has found her own. For me, nothing compares to being able to see that, as a daughter, being able to see that. And that's also one of the inspirations that I bring into the work that I get to do. But I don't know, how else do I talk about how folks are finding each other and getting excited. In the app, there's like I said, there's a chat space. There's I think 5 affinity groups that you could uh, just start, open up and start finding folks in. And we've had folks find each other in Australia, are like, are you in Sydney? I'm in Sydney too. Are you progressive? Yes, I am. I didn't know there were other people like this. And just start to build that network and connect. Right now we have a couple free shelves in the app because you do have to subscribe it. We're a publication, we pay people. Um, and we have decided to keep open this Beloved Arise shelf for LGBTQ teens because we know how tough it is to be a teenager on top of being closeted because you can't tell your parents, or you have told your parents and it's just really stressful. We have this shelf that's just about, the teen experience. And the responses that we get from that are amazing. Folks just like realizing how much God actually loves them, how, their identity isn't held against them when they're thinking about eternity,
Right.
one way or the other. I don't know. I'm excited about the community that I get to find here. I found you here.
I mean, vice versa. It's like um, even giving this interview is like strange for me because I'm here asking all these questions, but I'm also here like super jazzing into it. And like, you know, as somebody who's benefited from this, it just, for me, it's about, I want people to experience. I want people to get to know that there's more out there than what they may be exposed to, and that there are folks out there who understand and who know what it's like to be queer, to be a person of color, to be struggling with their body, to be, you know, or addiction or relationships or whatever, and not to be fed pat answers about your faith, right? That like pray harder only goes so far, right?
Right.
And that, you know, the gosh, I can go on a soapbox. I'm actually going to segue into our next question,
Okay.
because I feel like we can really integrate this really well. But I noticed that you were quoted in an article dated on March 15th for the Baptist News, and it was about the Deconstructionist Playbook.
Yeah.
And the title is "The Deconstructionist Playbook Offers Devotionals for Those Wary of the Church." And true, accurate. But there's a quote in there that stands out to me, and it says, "We come at this from the perspective that faith is a journey, that there is no concept of backsliding here." And I was wondering if you could just speak more on that, because I feel like that concept of backsliding is really strong. I mean, I'll say even in my journey into progressive Christianity, I always had that in the back of my mind, right? Like, what would people say? What is this? And I have my own responses to it now, but I wanted to hear sort of some of your thoughts on this.
You know, I think it just starts with seeing everybody as holy. And when I say holy, I'm saying everybody is a spiritual person. Everybody has breath in their lungs. Everybody has life. Everybody is spiritual. And so when you look at it that way, that, you know, being spiritual doesn't mean when you look at it as if spirituality is a thing that you are born with and not something that can be taken away depending on your behavior, you start to see that like we're all on a journey trying to figure out how God loves us. Will God love me in this situation? Can God love me if I do this? Does God love me because of this bad thing is happening to my community? You know, when you start to take out that factor of who and where, you start to see that God is always there. So on the website, we talk about, you know, spirituality being a spectrum and faith being a journey. And that I see my relationship with God less as a ladder that I need to climb, you know, to get to enlightenment, you know, to get to actually be a righteous person and to get to heaven, and more like a stream that we're all wading into, you know. And when you're wading into a stream, sometimes you go deep and sometimes you go shallow, but the intent is still to cross the stream, basically. And in this stream, you can look to your left and your right, and you see other people also in it. And sometimes the water is down at their ankles, and sometimes it's up to their necks. And I think that can illustrate or be a metaphor for how deep you actually are in your spiritual journey. Sometimes it is the Bible or your holy book is all you can think about, and the water's up here. And sometimes the water's down at your ankles. It doesn't mean that you are not engaging. It just means that that's where you are in your journey. You know, I think about my mother and how an outsider looking in would say, "You don't go to church, are you still a Christian?" But having an actual conversation with Miss Ann Cheatham will show you that she is full of light, you know, full of love, and God is in her. And so this idea that there's no backsliding also gives room for folks in other faith journeys. If you are Muslim, if you are Jewish, how do we love those people around us when their faith doesn't look like ours? Well, in this stream, it doesn't matter, you know, I can look to my left and my right, and I can see that you are a spiritual person, and that I can honor your faith journey because I know that God is with you regardless, whether you recognize her or him or not.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I feel like that's like one of the cornerstones of my theology that was really shaken up in seminary. This idea of, if we believe that everybody was made in the image of God, creation, the Imago Dei, right?
Mhm.
Why, like, why discriminate, right?
Yeah.
Why? um and I also came from an environment where everybody was keeping score, keeping tally of not
Yeah.
just other people's faith, right, and how they expressed it, but our own as well. And I remember when shortly after I had gotten baptized as a college student, I remember thinking to myself, my biggest fear, I hope I never backslide, right?
Yeah. Of
And
people
like,
seeing you as yeah. Hmm.
yeah. And 19-year-old me looking at me now, like, I don't know, like, superficially, I would think that I would be horrified, right?
Hmm.
Or like that 19-year-old me. But at the same time, I, resonate a lot with your mom's story. Like, I've never felt closer to God, right? And I am very distanced from my community, and it is very hard, or the community that raised me. And some folks have written me off as I think the worst insult I got on Facebook was an apostate. um, and some folks still respect me and engage, and um, are open to where I'm at, and
Yeah.
don't write me off. And I find that to be really, really healing. Um, but this idea, this fear of backsliding, of just it being so antithetical to the concept of grace, right?
Hmm.
And to the concept of, like, one of the things that I think Christianity could do better is this idea of just even honoring people's autonomy, right?
Yeah.
Their agency, their God-given wisdom,
Hmm.
experiential wisdom, their experiential relationship with God, and how that drives them, how the
Yeah.
Spirit works as it will, not outside of ways that these boxes would have us think are legitimate, right?
Yeah.
Um, I just really think that concept, backsliding, is really weaponized.
Yeah.
And for me, I think it's simple because it keeps you from God, and it keeps you from community.
Yeah.
That fear or that judgment that other people will put on you.
To me, it's that same logic that, if you're not exhausted, then you're not working hard enough. This idea that in order to be a good person and good at your job and worthy of praise means that you have to like be working 10-hour days and going just like full speed ahead. And we know that that's really unhealthy, that you're going to burn yourself out, and nobody should be working 10-hour days for it's like forever, or even for a long amount of time. But it's this idea that there's some kind of reward in being exhausted, in not paying attention to yourself, in not checking in. And when it comes to backsliding, yes, you absolutely need to check in with yourself, spiritually. Is going to church every week actually helping me? Or do I need to take a step back from these people, and this system? Or, is praise music actually helping me? Or do I need to take a step back because some of these messages are so repetitive that it feels like I'm not getting anything from it. Yeah, there's our community really needs to take a closer look at, mental health and how that plays a role in how and how effective we are as Christians.
That's a really good point, Crystal. And that's actually the driver of my work in practical theology. For me, I like to push back on the narratives, the popular narratives about like folks, particularly millennials, who are leaving the church as if they're just becoming more secular and that's it, end of story. It's this big crisis, right? But for me, what I'm noticing is that like folks are being a lot more aware of some of the negative aspects of church culture, right? And that affect particularly marginalized folks, minoritized folks in a much deeper way, right? And it's not just like doctrinal differences or, you know, theology, intellectual beliefs, but it's actually like beliefs and policies and communities and environments that at their worst can be abusive and toxic.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so there's some work that's being done now on religious trauma and religious trauma syndrome, which has a lot of similarities and I think might soon be classified as another layer of a complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
Wow.
So I think about some of the work and the writing that's out there, and I think that there's just so much room to learn more. And really, who folks should be listening to are the folks who have had these experiences, who have decided to leave, who have gone through it. And that's part of the work that I want to do, highlighting it and then eventually like studying it more. And there's just so much room to explore these things when you're not afraid, right? When you're not told that this is contrary to what it means to be like a true believer and to have faith, right? When you know that you can question, when you can think critically, when you can take experiences seriously. And I think about that along with what you just said about this sort of logic that um, you have to like prove, you have to earn, right? And I think it's like, you know, very much like, what is it? The capitalist, like,
Yes.
myth, right? The,
Mm-hmm.
shoot, I'm forgetting the exact phrase right now. The myth of, forget it. What I'm noticing is that there are a lot of parallels in what you just said, Crystal, and about the ways that we overwork ourselves, right? As if to prove and to earn. And if we're not exhausted, like you said, at the end of the day, then we're not doing it right. And how we do that with our faith, right?
Yeah.
We're always clocking. Where are we? Where are we? We're always clocking other people. Where are they? Where are they? And that just truly inhibits us from just living, right?
Yeah.
And learning and gleaning, because we're imposing this standard that I don't think is actually helpful.
No.
It's one of my big frustrations with the church right now. This sort of all or nothing thinking, right?
Right. It's exhausting to think that there is something that you can do to be outside of God's love, to not be worthy anymore, or that there is something that you can do that your community won't want to engage with you anymore. That is terrifying. That is overwhelming. And it doesn't have to be that way, I think.
No.
Yeah. I'm sorry that's been your experience. It's tough.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you. And as I'm saying this, I'm thinking about so many folks who I know and love who've been forced to leave because it wasn't safe for them to be there, or they transgressed in a way that
and see, that's when you lose people. You lose people in your community because you are pulling them and stretching them in ways that they don't, that doesn't fit them, you know. And with our Bible app, we really have tried to create a neutral space where you do what you got to do, you know. And the language is there for folks who are um, trying to figure it out for themselves. It is a place of growth. It is a place of exploration. And I think that's how we allow people to stay in this community. There's, you know, we're just saying, as long as you're here in this community with me, just don't hurt me, you know. Don't yuck my yum. Don't shoot down what I'm doing because it makes you feel better. And then we're all able to coexist in this space. I just feel like it's terrible that people are choosing to just shut down this part of their heart.
Yeah.
Because they don't know how to do it right, you know. They're shamed into feeling like anything they do is going to be wrong. And I just feel like that's outside of the way God intends it to be.
Yeah. As a quick aside, like, I think about, there's so much precedent in different Christian streams for ambiguity and for growth. Like, I think of in Ignatian spirituality, so the framework indicates that, like, God is in all things, right? And you're going to experience seasons where you feel, like, to use the language, like, on fire for God, or that you feel close to God, connected, and they call that experiences of consolation, right? But the Ignatian spirituality says that you'll also experience periods where you're down, where you're doubtful, where you feel disconnected, where you're angry, where you're disillusioned, and that's just part of the normal faith journey. Or, like, this concept of dark night of the soul, where you know, similar. And, like, not to give precedence or priority to these two frameworks, but I think about that plus, like, you know, Lamentations, Psalms, or imprecatory Psalms, or just people's lived experiences, right? It's not all positive. It's not all happy, happy, shiny, shiny. I think about, you used a really excellent phrase earlier, spiritual bypassing that temptation, which I think is also a function of this sort of capitalistic mentality of, like, you have to earn, right? Well, who are you trying to be positive for, right? Who are you trying to convince, right? And do we not, as humans, experience grief and doubt and disconnect, right, from our communities, right? Do we have to paper over every little hardship in life with a Bible verse or a platitude, right?
No, in fact, it's hurtful, you know. When I look at just all of the police killings, you know, we had George Floyd's killer was convicted, right? And on the same day, a 15-year-old girl was shot 4 times. A young man was shot in his car. And how many of us in the Black and brown community look at that and think, where was God? You know? And we use this term spiritual bypassing, which is somebody saying it's all in God's plan, you know, thoughts and prayers. That is spiritual bypassing. And for me, there's many times like that where I think, well, where was God? Where is God? And when you take out this spiritual bypassing, I'm given the permission to be mad at God and to ask the question, where were you? Why does this keep happening? And honestly, that question has I read the devotionals in our Bible app. There's, Lenny Duncan has written some really good things about race in there. And there's a whole shelf for race in America, which allows my vision of God to expand, leaning into the doubt of, man, I don't think God was in that situation at all. If so, where was God?
Right.
Yeah. Spiritual bypassing is very destructive.
Yeah.
I forget where that question came. I don't know if that was a question, but yeah, I just went on a tangent there. But
Listen, I'm glad we're here because we need to talk about it, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And it's one of the things I appreciate most about womanist theology.
Mm-hmm.
So womanist theology's perspective on the crucifixion is very like anti-spiritual bypassing.
Mm-hmm.
Because most of the dominant theologies, and there's so many, are either like, this had to happen in order for us to be saved, or Jesus died for you because you are so terrible.
Right.
And just a lot of these atonement theologies, right, can be really harmful, right? And unfortunately, they're the most popular in this period of time. But they're not the only ones, right? There are tons of theologies that try to make sense of what the crucifixion did. And womanist theology names the crucifixion of Jesus as a sin. It was a sin that Jesus was crucified. It was a sin that, and shameful and horrible, that he caused so much trouble in his life, for that he got on the bad side of the powers that be that came and killed him. Jesus was murdered on the cross, right? Not only was he murdered, but this was something that didn't please God, right? Even if, even with the resurrection, on the horizon, right? It still wasn't something that pleased God. Where was God in that? God was with the mourners. God was crying the way, and I think that's from, I forget right now. God was in solidarity. God was in pain. God was mourning. God was broken by this tragedy, and God was with the people who who were experiencing this tragedy. Like, God knows what it's like to be the mother of a kid who was unjustly taken.
Yeah.
Right? And God isn't rushing to find redemptive value in this terrible, terrible tragedy, right?
Yeah.
The moment of the crucifixion should be called for what it is, period, right?
The murder.
And I feel like there's no room for that kind of theology when we have spiritual bypassing going on.
Yeah.
When we have to, but God is in this somehow, and God's gonna come, and God's going to like change things. Right? How?
Right.
When? Right?
Yes. I get mad when I don't have enough to pay my bills or do what I need to do. And I look over and there are people with just so much. And it's like, does God love them more?
Mm-hmm.
Here I am. And I need to look into that. I need to dissect that and really start to think about, do I really think that God is a God who gives some people more and takes away from people who have nothing?
Right.
And spiritual bypassing says, what do people say when God will provide, it'll be okay, just pray. And I'm like, no.
There's a kind of a meme that goes around occasionally, and I forget exactly what it is now, but it's kind of like in the spirit of, is it really that you're blessed, or is it just money?
Right. It's just money, and money makes
Right.
everybody feel blessed. But
Right.
also, like, what I'm saying with that spiritual bypassing message is that I don't have to think about capitalism. I don't have to think about the way that it is unjustly oppressing a lot of people, you know. If I allow myself the right to see that my poverty is unjust, that it is a sin, that there is just so much greed at the corporate level in the world. If I allow myself to see that, then I'm giving myself a form of redemption. I'm relieving myself of this duty to praise a God that in the back of my head I think doesn't love me enough to actually give me something, or a God who wants me to be poor. You know, I don't think God wants anybody to be in poverty. I don't think I think that we as humans need to do better. And when you allow yourself to ask those questions, you start to see the real monsters in the room. You know, the capitalism is a real monster in the room, and we as people of faith, it is our duty to take that monster down, you know, is to push against that system, which means that I need to think twice about where I'm spending my money. I need to think twice about what laws I'm voting for. I need to think twice about, you know, where I send my kids to school, because am I supporting this capitalistic greedy system, or instead of saying, you know what, it's in God's hands.
Right.
God will take care of it.
Yeah.
God wants you to take care of it. God wants you to take care of it. God wants you to do something about it. And one of our authors, you know, Joe Lumen, talks about this idea of creating a heaven on earth. And for a while, I was just like, that seems like you've gone a bit too far for me, you know. And I've begun to understand what she means, that once we start to truly defeat these monsters, we do have, it will require us to work together in a community driven way that is the closest thing I've ever thought to a utopia to be, you know, people working together. You know, there's that picture of um, the people with the spoons, like their spoons are too long. They're trying to eat some soup, and everybody has like a spoon that's this long, and you can't actually get the spoon to your mouth. But if you take the spoon and feed the person next to you, then everybody can eat, right? And I'm like, that's what Joe Lumen is talking about when she talks about heaven on earth. If we can create a society where it's built on helping and giving instead of taking and keeping.
Right.
Spiritual bypassing, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. No, I'm just really loving this because I feel like this is a real time example of us wrestling theologically, right? And this is just what we do. This is what progressive Christians have been doing. This is what Christians have been doing for since the beginning of time, right? It's just not as popular right now because, you know, especially with mass media, right? You get slivers, you get folks who are not equipped to talk about this work because they haven't done it, right?
Yeah.
And these are the faith leaders, right? These are the bestsellers, right?
Yeah.
But there's such a richness. There's such a richness that comes from just lived experience and having to reject some things and say, you know what, no, I'm not going to take the easy answer. That's not helpful to me. In fact,
Right? It's not.
to me, right? And, you know, I have, you know, eyes and a brain and common sense and discernment. And like, I'm not going to sit with the pat answer when I know that, like, if my experience is complex and I believe that God is with me and shaping me, then God can be with me and shape me and help me come to an understanding that is more generative, right? That is more life affirming, that is more life giving, right? Like to me, that's faithfulness, right?
Yeah.
And I have a really hard time with sort of the implication that it's not. that it's just doubt, that it's just backsliding, that it's just throwing away what you learned because you're just listening to the ways of the world and all these kinds of things. And it's like, no, actually, I'm just discerning.
Yeah.
You know? And a lot of that work is done individually, but so much of it is done in community. And I'm so grateful for communities like yours and just
Amen to that.
you know, who show us that it is possible.
Mm-hmm.
It's fine.
Amen to that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Crystal. I'm just, as somebody who is part of HTI and the HTI community, I know that so many of us as scholars who have gone through the program or are now gone and are professors or clergy or doing something else wonderful in the world, we all have had experiences where we've had this culture clash, right? And in our programs especially, right? And we have this theological sort of foundation, this theological like training or whatever, and a lot of us struggle to know like what to do with it, right? How do we use our experiences or sort of the tools that we've had to like analyze in a way that can be a bridge sort of to our communities, right? But for a lot of us ourselves, we're kind of stuck at that same position, right? Where we're like, okay, yeah, we have access to this, but like, what does this actually mean?
Yeah.
So I think about just anything and everything that makes theology accessible and that helps reflect sort of the wisdom that we just have within us through our experiences, right?
Yeah.
As just powerful. And so I'm grateful that our community, I say our specifically right now as a member of like HTI, but also as, for those of us who are in these both and spaces, that there are resources out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm
There
just,
are now.
yeah, and I'm so grateful for it. And I'm so grateful for your vision and your hard work, you and Teresa and the team. And then just, I think this is just a really powerful beginning, and I can't wait to see what comes up the pike. So
Thanks,
I just want
friend.
to, thank you. I
That
just want to
means the
thank
most.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for joining us. It's been so great to talk about these topics with you. And from all of us, hope to see you soon, see you again, see you out there, and the work continuing.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
This has been an HTI production. For more information, visit us at htiopenplaza.org. The Hispanic Theological Initiative provides Open Plaza as a public service. The views expressed by the guests are their own. Their appearance on this program or any reference to a specific product or entity they represent does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by HTI.